Moving into our text for today. Yes, now we can hit that title slide. Last week, I mentioned, if you recall, that in a sense, each family unit is kind of like a little church. Remember, we made that point. Not a substitute for church, mind you. We're not independently functioning churches, but there is a sense in which every family is kind of like its own little church. And we talked about specifically the responsibility of the husband to be kind of a pastor who shepherds and who cares for his family in every way, but especially spiritually, we talked about last week. There is a sense in which every person in here, if you are a husband and you're a Christ follower, you're sort of like a family pastor of your family. There's a very real thing. And with that truth as a backdrop, it should not come as any big surprise then that we as parents have a precious responsibility to care for our children and to bring them up to know and to love the Lord. That is a responsibility on our part. Just like, I would say, like I said a minute ago, the church makes and grows disciples. We as parents, we make and we grow disciples in our own little homes. That's part of our job. And today, we're moving along in the book of Ephesians, and we're now going to be hitting chapter 6. Chapter 6 is the last chapter in the book. So yes, that means our Ephesians series is gradually wrapping to a close. Boo. Toward the end of chapter 5, Paul was talking about how our lives should be different once we come to faith. Because before we were walking in darkness, now we're supposed to be walking in the light. And how, therefore, we should be filled with the Spirit. And we should be doing things out of the influence of the Spirit. And one of the ways this plays out is in our relationships. And that's why we just spent the last 2 weeks talking about the mutual responsibilities of husbands and wives toward each other. Our next stop is the relationship between children and parents. That is where we're hitting today. So if you have your Bibles with you and you have your Bibles open, I would encourage you to read along with me. If not, as always, we will have the words on the screen. But let's dive in. This morning we're looking at Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And we're going to be discussing the primary responsibilities of children toward their parents and also of parents toward their children. So let's read this. Chapter 6, verse 1. Paul says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." That's all we're looking at today. So we begin this morning with Paul's commands to children. That's where we're starting. Because even though their responsibilities are lesser, comparatively speaking, children have fewer responsibilities, their lives and their character are every bit as important as adults. Every bit as important. They just are. In fact, it would have been hard as a believer in the city of Ephesus receiving this letter against that backdrop of their culture at the time. It would have been hard receiving this letter not to be a little bit kind of jarred by what I'm about to say. The fact that Paul would even include instructions to children in the letter at all, in and of itself, that's going to be a shocker. This was a day and this was an age where children were not typically regarded much at all, if at all. They just didn't exactly, they weren't exactly highly prized, and they weren't exactly thought of as great things. In the Roman culture, during the time that this letter was written, I think this is going to be kind of hard for us to take into account, or to wrap our minds around, but hear me clearly on this. During this time, and in this culture, if you were a parent, and you had a baby, and you decided you did not want that baby, you could literally go out and throw that baby in the trash heap with no reprisal. You would not get in trouble for that. It was just, if you didn't want your baby, you just went and threw the baby away. You would go throw this baby in the trash heap, and this was common. You would just go throw him out there, knowing full well that one of two things was going to happen to that baby. Either the baby was going to die in the trash heap, and nobody cared, or there were people who actually went around and collected those babies. And they would take those babies, and they would sell them into slavery. They would sell them into the gladiator schools to grow up and be trained to fight and die. And some of them were raised for other professions that we won't mention. So you knew when you threw that baby into the heap what you were committing that baby to. And you could do that, and people did do that all the time, and it was not illegal. You did not get in trouble for it. You just got rid of it. Weak and deformed babies sometimes were just killed outright. They didn't even bother, just kill it. Children themselves did not exactly have a lot of rights. They just didn't. The children in that day and age, they were just basically ruled over by their fathers. Their fathers just ironclad, this is what you're going to do, period. So the sheer fact that Paul would include instructions to children in the church in that day, with that as the backdrop, tells us some important things right off the bat. Number one, that there were children in the church. We know that there were children in the church listening to this letter because they're receiving instructions. And that also tells us that those children were participants in the church. They had their own set of instructions. Paul was including them, giving them their own sets of instructions. We see that those children were valued and had their own roles and responsibilities. They were not ignored or overlooked. Paul was speaking to them just like he was speaking to everybody else. We've already talked in this series at various points about how every single human being, just by virtue of being made in the image of God, every single human being has inherent worth and inherent dignity. So why not kids too? In fact, if you look at Matthew chapter 19, verses 13 through 15, some people actually brought some children to Jesus one day. And look what happened. The text says, "Then children were brought to him," meaning Jesus, "that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples rebuked the people. But Jesus said, 'Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven.' And he laid his hands on them and went away." Jesus had a very high place in his heart for kids. And we see that reflected in the way the church was instructed with the kids in it. We see here in Ephesians 6, children even had a role to play in the church. I mean, they did. They're receiving instructions in the letter. They have a role to play. We just talked about youth ministry. When I was a youth pastor over at my previous church, when I was a youth pastor over there, I used to remind my youth about this on a regular basis. And not every week, but on a regular basis, I would remind them, you know what? You are not the future of the church. Sometimes you hear people say that. Well, you know, the kids, they're the future of the... You're not the future of the church. You are the now of the church. You are the now. If you're in the church and you're a Christ follower, you're a Christ follower. You're a part of the church now. There's this weird assumption in church circles sometimes that kids and teenagers, they're the future of the church. But if they've professed faith in Christ and they're a believer, they're every bit as much a part of the church right now as the oldest person in the room. There's no two ways about it. So, let's break down this first command in verse 1. Paul says, "Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." Obey your parents. Remember last week when we talked about husbands and wives, and we saw that, you know, the wife respects the husband loves the wife. You notice Paul never once in any of those instructions said obey. He never told anybody to obey anybody else. Here, today, we see Paul using the word obey. Here he says obey. That's because parents are placed in a position of authority over their children, which both parties are expected to take seriously. Children, obey your parents. any child who is still under the authority of his parents or her parents is to obey his or her parent. Yes, obey. Because typically, the parents know best, and they've got the life experience and the wisdom to back up what they're saying. But they also have, we see here, the God-ordained responsibility. It is a God-ordained responsibility to be in charge. And I don't know if you ever thought about this, or if anyone's ever pointed this out to you, but even Jesus, we talked a couple weeks ago that even Jesus submitted. Do you know that even Jesus submitted to and obeyed his parents? Do you know that the Lord of the universe submitted himself to his earthly parents? We look at Luke chapter 2. There's a story where his parents lose him. Imagine losing Jesus. They lost Jesus when they left Jerusalem. Like, oh goodness, where's the Lord and Savior? So it gives a whole new meaning to, like, have you found Christ? So they lose him. And then they have to go back and find him, and they find him. They go back and they find him in the temple. And they question him when they get there about, what are you doing? And I've got the text for that. Luke chapter 2, verses 50 and 51. When they find him and he answers them after they start questioning him, the text tells us, and they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. In other words, they didn't understand what he was talking about. But then it says, and he went down with them being his parents and he being Jesus, and came to Nazareth, and watch this, and was submissive to them. And he was submissive to them. And then it adds, his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. So we see that Jesus submitted and obeyed his parents, despite the fact that he was literally their God. Their God, they were raising their own God from infancy to adulthood, and he was submitting himself to them. He was obeying his parents. Sometimes the question comes up, what if your parents tell you to do something wrong? What if your parent tells you to, go break some law or something like that? Notice it says, obey your parents in the Lord. All right, I do want to point that out, because the basic rule here is if a parent commands a kid to do something that goes against the law of God, there is a general rule here, a general principle that says, in those situations, the law of God comes first. So we do need to be careful that how far we push that parental authority. The law of God comes first, but even in that, I would argue that you as the child, as much as you can be, should be careful and respectful in how you address that with the parent. Just might want to be careful with that. Well, Mom, in the Bible it says that you are telling me to do something very, very wrong. Anyway, we need to be careful about that. But we do need to be aware that parents are not perfect. Sometimes we may slip up. And so there are situations where even the kid's highest allegiance is to God. But so long as we're functioning and not telling him anything contrary to the words of God, that kid is supposed to be obeying his or her parents. The second command is to honor your parents. I would argue you can age out of obeying your parents. There comes an age where you don't have to obey them anymore like you used to. But you never age out of showing respect and honor to your parents. You never, ever age out of it. This is something here that is applicable to everyone in here. If you have a living parent, at least one living parent, this is applicable to you right now. You are not to dishonor or disrespect your parents ever. I don't care if you're a kid or if you're 75 years old. You are not to disrespect or dishonor your parents. Not in your words and not in your actions. Because you can do either one, right? You don't have to necessarily disrespect them to their face to disrespect them. And I get it. Maybe your parents are very hard to get along with. Maybe your parents are a little overbearing. Maybe your parents can be kind of rude sometimes and spout off at the mouth and leave you in a difficult situation. Maybe, I don't know, I hope nobody. Show of hands, anybody? No, don't really. That can happen, all right? But I would remind you, at the same time, the Bible says, do not repay evil for evil. That's one. Honor has to do with your overall attitude towards somebody, how you treat somebody, and how you esteem them. And so what I would say in this situation is, as adults, we may not always agree with everything our parents say or with everything our parents do. We may never agree with them, but that never gives us license to disrespect them. So we just need to be careful, all right? That doesn't mean they get to walk all over you. I recognize there's not a lot of little kids sitting in the room right now, so I'm going to talk more to you adults that have living parents. That doesn't mean they get to walk all over you either and run your life. That's not what I'm saying at all. You do have a right, and I would even argue a responsibility, to establish healthy boundaries. This is the boundary here for yourself as an adult. Not just an adult in society, but an adult Christ follower. You have that right and that responsibility. Just be careful how you communicate that boundary. That's where you can go wrong. Well, you know what, woman? I am not going to listen to you anymore. Like, whoa, let's back up a little bit. Healthy boundaries, but communicated respectfully. Okay, that's where we need to be careful. And you may have noticed there in verse 3 that Paul says that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Just so we're clear, he's not literally promising them long life. He's not literally telling them, if you obey your parents and you honor your parents, you're going to live for a long time. What he's actually doing there is he's quoting from the Ten Commandments. And he's reminding them that in Old Testament times, when God was setting aside the nation of Israel, he actually did make that promise to those people at that time. Because what Paul's doing is he's reminding his listeners at the day and age when he was writing this letter, he's reminding them, hey, you remember way back when God first created that commandment, clearly this means something to him. Clearly this means something to him. Because as you read through those 10 commandments, most of them are just do this or don't do this. This commandment actually has a promise that ties into it. Go back and reread those. God said through Moses in the 10 commandments, honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. He put a promise with that command. And Paul's just reminding them, this is a big deal to God. How we treat and honor and respect our parents is a big deal to God, and God is personally invested in that relationship. Truth bomb number 1. We all owe a debt of gratitude and honor to our parents, if for no other reason than because they gave us life and because God commands us to do so. That's a big truth bomb. It takes up almost the whole screen. My apologies. But we all owe a debt of gratitude and honor to our parents, if for no other reason than because they gave us life and because God commands us to do so. And now we move on to verse 4. Verse 4, tiny little verse. Short little verse, not a lot of words. Big verse. Lots of stuff embedded in that verse. 3 commands actually embedded in just a few words. Paul says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So, last week I mentioned that husbands are kind of like the pastors of their homes. Brought that up again a little while ago, in the sense that they shepherd over their families and care for their families. And they're ultimately responsible for the spiritual support of their families. Along those lines, we see Paul kind of singling out the father here. You'll notice that the command is directed directly to the fathers. This does not negate the role of the mother. I just want to be very, very clear. Paul's not excluding the mothers here. He's just re-emphasizing that responsibility that God has laid on the husband to die to himself, as we've been talking about, and serve his family. He's just re-emphasizing that. So this is not taking the mothers out of the equation. He's just re-emphasizing that huge responsibility he's been talking about. Because remember as well, because we just saw it last week, Paul also said that the husband and the wife are a team. We saw that the two become one flesh. So both parents, father and mother, need to pay attention here. Okay, we just looked at our responsibilities to our parents, but now we have to look at our responsibilities to our children. Okay, so he's not negating the role of the mother. This is a command to everybody who is a parent. Paul says, do not provoke your children to anger. So what I'm saying here, the command is to nurture your children. Nurture your children. Now, I looked at this verse in a bunch of different translations, trying to get a sense of what's going on here. Paul says, do not provoke your children to anger. And after comparing a whole bunch of different translations, I think I realize what this means. You know what this means? Do not provoke your children to anger. Okay, that is my very, very deep word study there. Okay, when it says do not provoke your children to anger, he is literally saying do not provoke your children to anger. Now, a moment ago, I spoke about how kids were treated in the society at the time that this was written. All the horrible things people did, and how fathers tended to be the final word on the matter. Like, I said this is the way it's going, and this is the way it's going, and that's the end of the story. Absolute authority, and they could be quite strict, and sometimes quite cruel to their kids. All right, this is the society that these men and women grew up in. That was their backdrop. I've said it before. I'm going to say it again right now. Culture gets a lot of things wrong. Society gets a lot of things wrong. When we come to faith, part of our job, part of our task as Christ followers is unlearning some things that were taught to us that were incorrect. Unlearning the misconceptions and the lies, and then relearning things the proper way. That is a big part of our job. These parents needed to relearn the value of their own children. A lot of them were not raised in such a way that they would have thought this way naturally. We would do well to do the same and think about how precious our children are. Hey, girls. We need to think about how precious our children are. And the one that's missing, I'll tell her later that she's precious too. And let's be honest. A lot of the things we do as parents make our kids mad. You ever been mad? How many minutes has it been? A lot of things we do make... So is Paul telling us that we can never make our parents mad? Is that the idea here? That we can never even make our kids mad? Sometimes just trying to parent them makes them mad. Clean up your room. Oh, I'm mad now. Are we supposed to not parent our kids just in case they get mad at us? No. Notice the wording. Do not provoke your children to anger. What Paul's talking about here is do not mistreat your kids in such a way that they develop a prolonged or a bitter anger. Do not mistreat them in such a way that they grow up mad. That's what he's talking about here. And the fact is, there are all kinds of ways, modern parents, maybe without even realizing it, we inadvertently discourage our children, or they cause them to feel unvalued, or even cause them to grow up resentful. And there's all kind of ways this can happen. This slide behind me are just a few examples. Okay, I'm hoping you can read that okay. There's a lot on there. This is just a few examples of the way we can do that. I'm going to kind of run through these for a second. All right, so if you can see that list, let's dive in. Sometimes we go too far in our discipline, and we cross over into nagging our kids. We need to be careful about that. Or we give them labels that are harmful or hurtful. I would advise you as the parent, I would advise you strongly not to say things like, you're bad, or you're hard-headed, or you're disappointing, or you're sloppy, or you're disobedient. I would strongly encourage you not to say things like that. Any of those, because what those are is those are labels. Those are labels you're putting on them. When you say you are fill in the blank, what you're doing is you're telling them essentially you are that thing. And you've put a label on them now that they have to wear. And that can crush them. And that can be a very heavy burden for them to bear. You're bad. You're disobedient. You're telling them they are that thing. And we need to remember the power of words. James talks about that in the letter of James. Instead, what I would recommend, and I don't think this is just psychological, like psychobabble here. What I would recommend is you would instead say something like, you are behaving badly. You are behaving badly. You are acting disobediently. What you did disappointed me. You're being stubborn, or you did that job sloppy. I hope you see the difference. I hope you see the difference. It's the same idea, but you're getting the point across without putting a label on them that they now have to wear. And what it does is it separates who they are from what they do. You don't have to tell the kid they are bad. You can just say, you're behaving badly. And now you've separated who they are from what they've done. And instead of them thinking, I am bad, like that's my character, that is who I am a bad person, they understand, no, I love you. You're a great person, but you did a bad thing. And so we just need to be careful, because even the way we communicate to our kids, a careless word, and hey, we've probably all been on both sides of that, right? We've probably thrown out careless words. We've also received careless words. I know as a kid, sometimes my parents said things off the cuff, and they were crushing and they were jarring. I would just advise us be very, very careful how we speak and the power of a careless word. We also need to be careful not to overly criticize. Our relationship with our kids needs to be more than just us cataloging all of their shortcomings. If all we ever do is tell them, well, you messed this up, you messed this up, you messed this up, that sends a message. That sends a message. We need to be careful that we don't overly criticize. Obviously, abusive behavior of any kind, physical or emotional, is going to be inappropriate. You don't get to abuse your kids. Some parents, let me back up. You never get to abuse your kids. You don't. But physically, emotionally, psychologically, or any other kind of abuse, you just don't do it. And yet, some parents who would never lay a hand on their kid physically, nevertheless scar them emotionally with the way they treat them, or the way they speak to them, or the way that they disregard them. And so emotional abuse is a real thing too. We need to be careful. So we don't abuse them, and we don't lay our hands on them in an abusive way. Just so we're clear, and you're gonna find where I stand on this issue right now, that doesn't mean you cannot spank your kids. I'm an advocate of spanking. I'm just, luckily, did not have to do it very often. But that does not mean you cannot spank your kids. Used correctly, as a disciplinary tool, spanking has its place. Not saying you have to spank your kids. I'm just saying this is where I'm coming from. It has its place as a disciplinary tool. If your kid reaches for the top of the stove and you've got stuff cooking up there, spank that hand. All right. Now, I know for most of us that's not our definition of spanking, but I'm going somewhere. Spank that hand. If your kid's about to run out into the middle of the street, you might have to grab them up and swat their bottom a couple of times. They're not going to like it. But I did the research on this. All right. I collected the statistics. You want to know what the statistics are on this? 10 out of 10 leading physicians agree that a sore hand beats a face full of boiling water every single time. All right, that's the statistics on that. Every single time. And sometimes you just need to make that point quickly and decisively. But here's the caveat to that. And I'm very thankful. We did a Bible study very early on. I don't even remember the name of the guy that led it. Very early on at our last church, years and years and years ago. And we covered this topic. And the idea here is spankings, when you do issue them, when you do lay out a spanking, should be reserved for basically two situations. All right, two situations here. For situations where you need to make an immediate point, like reaching for the boiling water or running out into the middle of the street, some of those things you don't get a second chance. Right? It only takes one time for that kid to run out in the middle of the street and get hit by a car. Sometimes you just need to make the point quickly and decisively. Fair enough. The second situation is situations where there has been what we call willful disobedience. Willful disobedience. In other words, when they disobey you on purpose. When they consciously choose to disobey you. I would very firmly caution you, do not ever spank your kids just because you're mad or frustrated. Okay? If you're hitting them for the purpose of hurting them instead of disciplining them, you've crossed the line. So the two situations are you need to make an immediate point or there has been willful disobedience. But not just because you're mad at them or frustrated. All right? If they accidentally drop something, even if it's something valuable, and it breaks, you do not spank them for that. It was an accident. Now, if you told them, don't touch that thing, and they went and grabbed it anyway, and then they dropped it and broke it, well, now we're talking about willful disobedience. Now you can consider spanking them. But just getting on your nerves, and I've been around those parents that they reach a boiling point and then they just start swatting. If they're just getting on your nerves and making mistakes, those are not spank-worthy offenses. All right, so kind of moving on from that one. Sometimes our expectations are too high. We forget that they're kids, and we start expecting them to know what we know and to conduct themselves the way an adult would conduct themselves, and that's just too high of an expectation to put on a kid. So sometimes when we put those expectations on them, they just can't live up to it, and they get frustrated. Sometimes we compare them to other people in a derogatory way. Well, I wish you were more like your brother. I wish you were more like your older sister. Can you imagine the kids growing up in Jesus' household, trying to live under his shadow? We need to be careful with that. You definitely do not want to create that dichotomy of, this is the golden child over here, and the rest of you are just underlings. So we need to be careful that we don't compare them in such a way where they feel thrown to the side. Here's another way. Inconsistent discipline. Letting them get away with something 9 times in a row, but then on the 10th time, we want to bring the hammer of God down on them. Talk about confusing. My mom kind of did that a couple of times in my childhood, and it really confused me. Like something that was okay, and then it was okay, and then it was okay, and then it was okay, and then just one day, I can't believe you did that. Like it's confusing, and it's not helpful. All right, here's another one. Never complimenting them for their achievements. Fun fact, they don't have to win a Nobel Prize. They don't. Maybe you just need to scale it down for their personality. Hey, you know what? I appreciate you taking your own plate to the sink. Thank you. That will help the family. Just finding opportunities to compliment them. And it's going to look different for a 4-year-old than a 6-year-old. But if you never compliment them, they're going to develop a complex about that. And related to that is this one. Never telling them that you love them or that you're proud of them. And this is a real shortcoming for some parents. They're not super emotional. They don't think to say things like that. But this will mess your kids up pretty badly. In our men's Bible study, which we're recently wrapped up, but at some point in the near future, once we get dates and all that, we're gonna relaunch it and have a round 2 with it. In our men's Bible study, during those lessons, we learned, this is very interesting to me, but we learned one of the things is that 85% of a person's ultimate personality, who they're going to be as a person, 85% of it is formed by the time that he or she is 6 years old. 85% of who they're going to be for the rest of their lives. Now, that doesn't mean you can't reverse, damage done. So I'm not trying to discourage anybody, but that's crazy to think about, isn't it? 85% of who they're going to be by the time they're 6 years old. Get in the habit of telling your kids that you love them and that you're proud of them, and get in the habit of doing that when they're little. And if maybe you messed that up already, no time like the present to start, it doesn't mean it's over. It doesn't mean it's over. But if you can get in there, and you can get in there early, start them on that foundation. I have the love and support of my parent. And like I said, if you already missed that 6-year milestone, start today. Maybe you've never told your kid that before. Or maybe it's just been a minute. Call your kid today. If you have a grown kid, just call him, her, them, however many you've got. Just cycle through your phone. Call every one of them and just say, I just want you to know I love you and I'm proud of you. Cannot go wrong with that. Here's another one. Placing your goals and your regrets onto them. Sometimes you hear of parents who will just sort of expect their kids to take over the family business. because this is our family business, with no regard to their unique personalities and their unique makeup and who they are. Or like, oh, you have to be a doctor because I was a doctor. It's just expected. You're just going to follow in my footsteps. Or maybe you were an athlete in high school or college. And so you force your kid into athletics and you drill them on athletics to be the best athlete they can be. And somewhere along the way, they get to thinking that's the only way they can make you proud, is if they follow in your footsteps and they're the all-star quarterback just like you were. Parent, usually that's on like Lifetime and Hallmark movies. You see you see that kind of stuff, or TV shows, but that's real. And there's a lot of ways that I would argue as parents we put expectations on our kids that it's really our burden, but without even realizing it, we've put it on them. And we just need to be very, very careful about that. And all of these are ways that modern parents, if we're not careful, we can provoke our kids to anger. We can provoke them to bitterness. But the good news is, I don't care if you've made one or even every one of these mistakes, just start today. Start today making the choices to kind of reverse that trend and go back the other way. It's never too late. It's never over. Truth bomb number 2. Don't do any of the things on that last slide. There's your truth bomb. Truth bomb number 2, don't do any of those things on that last slide. So I hope you got that while it was up there. If not, we'll throw it back up later. But those are things to avoid. And like I said, I just want to encourage you. I know that was a long list. Even if you saw yourself on that list somewhere, it doesn't mean you're a bad parent. It doesn't mean you've done irrevocable damage. If anything, it's just like, hey, here's a place I can start improving, and I know where to start. So think of it that way. The second command to parents is to bring up our children in the Lord, specifically in terms of how we discipline them and how we instruct them. Notice, though, that the context is talking about bringing them up in the Lord. Notice that's what he said. The most important thing that we as parents can do for our kids is point them toward Jesus. Period. Can we just get an agreement on that and an understanding? The most important thing that we as parents can do is point them to Jesus. Think about it like this. If your kid never enters into a living relationship with Jesus Christ, if your kid never does that, then they can do all their chores in a timely manner. They can be the best and brightest in their school. They can score 100 touchdowns per game. They can swim the fastest lap. They can win all the awards on awards day. They can get their PhD at 12 years old and find a cure for cancer. And they will grow old, die, and spend eternity in hell. You get it? None of that mattered when it was all said and done. It's not that those things don't matter. It's just that if that first thing isn't there, then the rest of it is, it's sort of the equivalent of spending all day building a really nice sandcastle and then coming back out the next morning and saying, where is it? Yeah, it matters. It's nice. But if you don't have the foundation in place, it's not going to come to anything. I'll say it again. If your kid does not have a saving faith in Jesus Christ, none of that other stuff matters. If you are a parent, or if you ever are a parent, consider yourself on notice. You're on notice here right now. You know your primary mission. Your primary mission is to show your kids Jesus. And there's all kinds of ways you can do that. Truth bomb number 3. The single greatest investment we can make in our children's future is to point them toward an eternal future with Jesus Christ. That is our primary job. To that end, Paul talks about bringing them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord, things that we will look at carefully next week. I don't think we want a 90-minute sermon today. These are things that we will look at carefully next week. Next week, we will deep dive a little bit more into what it means to be a parent who points your children to Jesus. That is the topic next week. But I will give you a tiny little spoiler, if you want one. Tiny little spoiler for next week's sermon, and here it is. The primary responsibility for your child's spiritual training is you, the parent. There it is. The primary responsibility for your child's spiritual training is you. Not the church, not the pastor, not your favorite Bible teacher. but you. You are the one who will show them Jesus 99% of their life. But please don't be intimidated by that. It's actually a precious responsibility if you think about it. Children are an incredible blessing from the Lord. They are. I can prove it. I've got 3 of them. And the joy of parenthood is really hard to match. It's really hard to match. And if anybody would know anything about this, think about it, it's our Father in heaven. It's our Father in heaven. If anybody's going to know anything about it, as much as we love our kids, as much as we want the best for them, our love for them pales in comparison to his love for us and to his love for them as his children. So if anyone knows about this, it's him. And as a loving Father who wants us to know his love, he also wants to equip us to show our kids his love. And so he's in it with us. He's in the trenches with us, and he's going to train us, and he's going to teach us how to do it if we'll let him. So come back next week, and we're going to talk about pointing your kids to Jesus. Okay? Will you pray with me?